Hi.
I'm so sorry, my phone, somebody called me and it just like went off. Oh, I'm so
It's a
sorry.
technological adaptation. We're so good at this,
Yeah,
Devangana.
great. Okay, so let's just backtrack for
Yeah.
30 seconds. We were talking about pedagogy, like, we were able to create a lot of curriculum and, like, kids going to this class and that class and all of that at the Harvard School, but that is a luxury which many schools don't have.
Yep.
Of just like, having somebody teaching this AC class and somebody teaching this open class and all of that. So let's just talk a little bit about diverse curriculum for different needs and different things.
Yeah. So I think I was sharing with you that like I've worked in systems that were not like that, right? Where you have big classes, lots of kids, they have very sort of rigid schedules and a lot of requirements that they have to meet, which are challenging for teachers to say, I'm teaching an AP class. I have this bar that all students have to sort of meet that they're all being assessed against. It's a really high bar. Why am I setting up students? Are they not being set up for success if they're coming to this class and they don't meet that minimum bar? And I think I was saying that, I talk to teachers about curriculum and education like it's a little bit of a hack, right? Like you have to look at the thing you're trying to get to and think about creatively the pathway to getting there that can be inclusive if you want to include more people, and it's not always going to be the straight line linear path that you've used before. So I referenced this earlier, but when I taught AP Lit in that sort of really diverse setting with diverse needs and big classes, that's where the theater pedagogy was really helpful to me because it was a completely different vehicle for getting across the same content in a way that was just more holistic, more inclusive, more flexible. And so what I often tell people is if you're in a tough spot and you need a different way of doing something, you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Look for a mental model from some other environment that maybe you can apply into this space to help people get closer to the mark, because I don't think it's realistic to say we're just going to do away with these testing standards. We're just going to do away that stuff is here. We have to deal with that as teachers and educators. But I do think that, again, if you want to get better at creating a more inclusive environment, you have to start somewhere. You have to try new things. You have to be willing to make adjustments and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that sometimes when we're having those discussions and we talk about the entry bars and those kinds of things, we're losing sight of like what we're supposed to be here to do, right? Which is to help students access their capacity to go out and solve problems. You talk a lot about independence, right? It's not really just about can you regurgitate this information on the test if I help you do that. It's can you problem solve? Can you handle these things when you're out in the world? And I think sometimes also for students with any kind of learning need, there's a temptation to sort of take them out of those traditional spaces and bubble wrap them and have them do stuff that's completely different. But like you and I know that there has to be that integration into more typical spaces to be able to show that actually, yes, you can engage in this environment. It just might be differently. It might take different strategies. So I may have wandered with the break a little far from your question, but I think the point is that um, if you're not in an environment that grants you the luxury of designing however you want,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that your system has no flexibilities in it. And it is, I think, your job as a teacher or a school administrator that's looking at these problems holistically to say, what do I have the freedom to play with that will allow me to include more styles of learning or more students, and just pay more attention to the actual skills and knowledge that I'm trying to cultivate instead of the boxes that I'm trying to check. And then I think you can make what seem like even really rigid environments more flexible.
So can I ask you a question?
Sure.
But sometimes it's really hard, actually. It's like right from the beginning of like let's say from nursery all the way to high school. If you get a kid on the spectrum in a classroom, it's actually a lot of extra work for the teachers, for the shadow teacher, for the special educator, for the co-teacher, for the head of the school. There's incidents of a kid hitting someone, biting someone, kid self-harm, like there's just all of these things. So sometimes it's just easier for the school to not actually be that inclusive, right? Like be like, you know what, we love our kids, but we don't want to take kids who are just going to be a menace in the school. How, as somebody who studied education leadership, how would you answer? Like I have a very personal point of view because I work directly with many kids on the spectrum. But how would you? Sorry, I'm still inaudible. But how would you, as somebody who's studied educational leadership and have been a leader across multiple schools, how would you answer?
So how would I sort of address that question of, yeah, like, why do we want to, and I know
Why
as an,
take a kid who's on the spectrum?
yeah, and as a leader, you also get the question, like, is it fair to other students if you have someone in the class who takes this much time and attention? These are reasonable questions, but, you know, I think for starters, a piece of this is being pretty mission driven and focused when you're leading a school. First of all, like, what are we here to do? I go back to this question a lot. Like, are we here to just educate a subset of the population? Is that even an option for us? Because every environment that I've been in, you get the students that show up, and that's kind of what you're dealing with. So um, I think that, and of course I'm like incredibly biased, Ivana, because you and I have both worked in environments and seen this stuff get, worked through in ways that make us believe that it can be worked through. Um, First of all, as a leader, you have to ask yourself, what are you equipping your team with? And that's I mean, that's just a real question that I think a lot of people don't want to really sit down and ask themselves as leaders. It's like, what setup do I have here? And just as I'm expecting teachers to design for students, what am I doing for them to set them up for success? So I really believe that people have to be, it's a show not tell situation. If you want people to do this in your environment, you have to show them that it can be done, even in one small way. And sometimes you're going to be the one who has to do it just to get them to understand that this kind of thing can be done. I think, and then you have to be really clear on sort of where the parameters are going to be. Some schools do not have the capacity to serve certain student needs. You and I both know that. There's sometimes tactical things that an individual child needs to be successful, one-to-one instruction or management that not every school is capable of providing for them.
Yeah.
I take that as a given. But you and I also know there's a huge spectrum of things that any school could provide a student with the resources they already have. They just don't know how to allocate those resources properly. So when I've been in those positions as a leader, I try to take them to some extent on a case by case basis,
Yeah.
because I think once you start trafficking in generalizations about students, it becomes an excuse to say, okay, we couldn't work with this one student, so now we can't work with any students who have that diagnosis or something like that. So I think getting really specific about what you're talking about is super important. And I think there's research around this, like, what are we saying we can or can't do? Have we tried it? If we wanted to try it, what resources would we need as a school leader, as a researcher? Can I bring some of those resources in to support? Many schools have those capabilities. The resources are either there or could be there. They're just not allocating things in healthy ways. So I think when you're tackling inclusion problems, it becomes really challenging, but also really important not to traffic in generalizations. I'll leave it there for now, but I think that you have to get really specific and sort of do an assessment of your environment and say, what might we have the capacity to engage with, what might we not, and let's try a few things, because even if it doesn't work with this student, it might allow us to serve some student in the future who doesn't have quite as extreme a set of needs but has some needs. And I think once you build into your culture a feeling of being willing to try to adapt, it just really changes people's mindsets when they see the student up front. And one thing I saw at the Harbor School was just that teachers who are not special education teachers, teachers who are quote unquote like mainstream classroom teachers, got so used to seeing how specialists dealt with certain situations, they realized, oh, I don't have to have a special degree in this to be able to do that. And it works, 75% of the time. The 25% of the time it doesn't work, we might have to go back to the drawing board. And so they operated in some ways like people who were quote unquote special education educators, just because they had exposure and support and a chance to try things in an environment where that was promoted. So I tell people that all the time. Some of these success stories are not schools filled with magical teachers or magical students. They're just people who have been set up for that kind of success.
100%, 100%. I think just teachers who want to make it happen, make it happen. It's as simple as that. You know, right now, I've only worked in the industry for about 13 years. And I do believe I've seen success stories is because I just want to make it happen. I'm like, this is it. We're going to make this work. So yeah. Yeah. Okay, so talk a little bit about, you know, since you kind of oversee a lot of inclusive schools and you've seen those in your past, um, what do you think, and I ask this question to everyone, what do you think is causing a rise in autism numbers? Like, I mean, just like, what do you think could be the causes for it? We just shot through about 38 to 76 kids in the spectrum of autism in the United States, and it's, you know, every one child out of 100 10-year-olds in India. So what do you think could be the cause for this rise?
The cause of the rise. Yes,
Yeah,
I'm just making sure I heard it.
yeah, the cause of the rise. Sorry, yeah.
I think that first of all, when you're aware of something, when you have definitions and terms for it and ways of a framework, you see it everywhere, right? So all of a sudden, I don't think I ask myself the question. I'm not an expert in this domain, so I will say that, but I ask myself the question all the time, like, is there a rise, or do we just have language for talking about something that's always been there?
Yeah.
And I think the more you start looking at the definitions and analysis of autism and what or spectrum, spectrum conversations, you start realizing that at some level, again, that kind of applies to lots of us, right? We all have these really individualized brains that approach problems in different ways. And some people's brains are individualized in a way that is more obvious than their sort of needs in that domain are more obvious. And I think that I think part of this now is like we're looking for it in a healthy way, right? We're looking for when a student struggles, people are much less inclined than they might have been 10 or 15 years ago to just say they're misbehaving, right? So sometimes a student is misbehaving, but sometimes there's something going on there. It reminds me of a student who he told me a story about how they were just doing so poorly when they were younger, and then someone realized like had a vision problem, they couldn't see, so they took them to an eye doctor and they got them glasses, and then all of a sudden their academics like weren't a problem, right? Because there was something, just they just needed a tool. And I think people are taking a much more nuanced look at students than they ever have before to say, if you're struggling in this class, is it because you're lazy, or is it because you have some executive functioning sort of need that isn't being met? And I think that what's really the tricky balance for educators and for parents is to support without enabling, right? Like to say, now that I know this, I want to support you to get the tools that you need to be successful. I'm not going to use that as an excuse to not educate you or to not put you in this environment and not push you, right? And I think it's such a difficult line to walk because you really want that awareness and care to be there, but that has to be backed up, first of all, with the support tools, which not everybody has access to, and then also with this commitment to saying, I'm not going to now let this become, okay, check, they have this diagnosis, so they don't have to do X, Y, and Z, but rather creating the pathway for them to become independent and successful in, even with that. And as you and I both know also, your brain working differently can also be a huge advantage in some spaces. So I think it's super important to look at this from an advantage standpoint, not just from a needs standpoint. But I think that for me, it seems anecdotally that this rise is at least in part, tied to just people's awareness and willingness to talk about it. That wasn't necessarily there.
I think so. Okay, just we have about like 4 or 5 minutes more. Is there anything else? I know we lost the first half of this conversation, but I want to post this part, whatever else, on my stories, just so people have access to you in this part of it. But is there anything else that you want to talk about? You've done some excellent work in Hong Kong. You've done some excellent work before that. Is there anything else that really stood out to you that you want to talk about?
I think I would just say, and I would love, your reflection on this too, Devangana, but I think like one educator to another, I think when you start talking about schooling and teaching and learning in this way, in this more inclusive way. Once I had some exposure to that, to me, it becomes much more exciting. Like designing classes, designing curriculum, thinking through pedagogy becomes so much more exciting, engaging, so much more of an artistic pursuit when you're not thinking in terms of sort of cookie cutter experiences, but actually something that's going to bring in, and I tell people all the time, you know, because I didn't sort of pursue a special education path per se in my own like research and schooling, I sort of wound up there. I've become more and more convinced that customizable, interestingly designed educational experiences are better for everyone.
Yeah.
For a lot of social emotional reasons as well as for learning reasons. But I also think that for a teacher or a curriculum designer, if you get in that headspace, it can also be just a much more fun and much more creative
Yeah.
pursuit. And I would be interested to think if you have experienced that the same way. But when I moved away from like always feeling really constrained by the design of my classes into being more open, it was really hard at first. It was really scary. I needed good modeling. I needed good tools, but it's made the design process just so much more exciting and so much more rigorous for me. And people talk a lot about teacher shortages and people leaving the profession. And I think some of that is in part, it's really hard in some senses, but it's not challenging enough in other areas. They're not being able to flex these really interesting muscles that a lot of creative people who go into education have and want to flex. So I think that's something that's always an interesting conversation for me is how we can open up training for teachers and support of teachers and designs of schools and systems to embrace this not as something for a couple of you're doing to accommodate a minority of students, but actually something that makes the whole teaching and learning experience and system better for everybody who's in it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There's a question about adaptability of teachers and disabilities. Um, that I'm waiting to hear the question. Yeah.
I
You
lost
got it
you a
right?
little bit again there. I'm so sorry.
I know you got it right. You got it
No,
right.
no, I lost you again a little bit the sound, but
There's a question that is in bigger colleges and more bigger schools, they don't have as many tools to support kids with disabilities. I think we kind of talked a little bit about this. When you got a large number, somehow the differentiation and the inclusion um, inclusion possibilities fall because when you're serving masses, there's this successful, easy to handle mass that's easy to serve rather than the ones who are trickier and harder. And that's why in bigger colleges and bigger schools, those things become hard. They shouldn't be, but they do.
I
Yeah.
I think that's true, Devon. But I think the one thing I'll just say is I saw this at my school in Houston, which was again huge. You can sometimes, I think, solve a lot of those problems by interrogating your systems. One
Yeah.
thing that we did there was find a way to create like a small community within the large community, right? There are ways to say, hey, with no more money, with no more resources, with the exact people and time constraints we have here, can we make adjustments to our design to make that kind of thing more possible than it looks like at face value? So I am on one hand like so
No,
empathetic to those.
but I fully hear you because I worked in
Yeah.
a 3,500 children's school and I've seen that happen. So, and at Columbia and I'm sure at Harvard we've seen like they have
Yes.
big disability services and groups and accommodations.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
can be done. It can be done.
yeah, yeah. Anything else before we close out? This is so good. It's just so good to chat with you because I miss having these conversations with that, but I figured that the resources they would be able to support people. I think you advocate for resources when you need them, and systems and schools are well equipped to do that.
Yes, and I think to your point about advocating for resources, when you really know what you want, this is something I really coach educators on. Like, let's get specific. You have a result you're trying to chase. This is something that comes up in my current job. Like, you have a result you're trying to chase. You're running into a barrier. If you're really specific about that barrier and you bring that to whoever your leadership is, 9 out of 10 times they want to help you because they understand that you need a really specific tool to solve a really specific problem to get a really specific result, as opposed to just saying broadly, I don't have the tools that I need to do this job. So I think you're right. I think those resources are out there,
Yeah,
and I'm just happy to always to discuss these things that we both love so much.
resources are there, systems can make it happen. It's just about teaming making it happen. So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, we saw wonders, we saw magic. My favorite prom was the one I went to Harvard, the one at Harvard School. So yeah.
Yes.
Anything else before we close out?
No, I think that's it. But just thank you so much for having me,
Yeah,
Devangana. This
great.
was so much
We covered
fun.
this, right? Like this is really helpful and this is so good. And I'm gonna put your email address on when I post this, just so that if anyone has any questions, they can just write to you.
Sure.
And
I'd be happy to talk to them.
thank you so much. Take care, and let's
Thank
catch up
you.
later on live. Bye.
Sounds
Take care.
great.
Love you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.